the need for artillery really hasn't changed. It is the one system that is versatile. It is very, very flexible. It's available 24 hours a day in all weather.
Artillery are here to stay and are perhaps going to reassume their dominant position on the battlefields of the 21st century that they had in the middle of the Second World War.
It was a very nasty weapon, and both sides used it. It was regarded as being something that should never ever be used again, and was banned by the Geneva Convention and has not been used by normal conventional forces since then, except, I understand, by Saddam Hussein.
As long as you've got your hatches closed, the world could be blowing up around you and you're not really bothered. And if it does blow up around you, you simply put your foot down and you just get the hell out of there.
We have a computer as a backup to a computer. We have a handheld computer that's a backup to that computer. But if they all break down, you've still got to be able to provide artillery support.
If the information that it's collecting at the time is of such a great importance, you can sacrifice the aircraft and you can leave it over the target until the last minute, or even until it runs out of fuel.
There's a lot of shouting, which keeps you on your toes and keeps you on the ball. You have to be a close-knit team. If you're not, then things don't start gelling and they don't really work.
Getting your targeting wrong and hitting civilians is becoming increasingly politically unacceptable, as well as morally so.
And it did come to a time when we were having a duel, battery on battery, duel with them. But obviously our professionalism surpassed theirs.
And what happened?
We wiped them out.
Artillery has been around for centuries. To Napoleon, it was the decisive arm. Stalin called it the god of war. But where has artillery come from? Where is it now? And what does it have to offer 21st century war?
Artillery was known by the Russians as the god of war, and this is a title that Stalin himself uses. You might say, why is artillery important on the battlefield? Well, we have to remember that throughout history, and particularly in the 20th century, that artillery has caused the lion's share of casualties on the battlefield. And by lion's share, I mean at least 2/3, and the percentage in the 21st century will probably rise to 85 to 90% of enemy casualties caused by land forces will come from artillery.
I think one of the most interesting aspects of the use of artillery en masse, for example during the First World War, is the sheer terrifying power of it. One of the worst effects of being at war was the fact that they could never get away from the artillery. They could duck down in their trenches and get away from sniper fire, but they couldn't hide from shells.
Artillery is pretty much all about firepower. But use the word artillery today and it conjures up images of men in smart uniforms behind a towed gun using a giant cotton bud to stuff cannonballs down a barrel and fire and then reload.
If we go back in time to the Napoleonic era, particularly, and certainly to the beginning of the First World War, we had a period there of at least 100 years where artillery was indeed those guns on spoked wheels firing at an enemy they could see. So you always had artillery pieces forward with the infantry, actually in and around their positions, firing forward. Well, that gave the infantry a morale boost because they had this kind of heavy support with them, and you always knew where the enemy gun line was. It was right in the middle of their position.
When they fired a cannonball, it was fired usually with the cannon at point blank. In other words, laid zero elevation, horizontal. And when the ball emerged, it would strike the ground, first point of graze, 300 to 400 yards ahead of the gun, and then skip across the ground, remaining below head height all the way. If you fired it in a looping trajectory, when it got to the other end, I'm talking about a solid ball, it would probably just dive straight into the ground and stop. If there happened to be somebody there, that person would be hammered into the ground like a tent peg. But if it was skipping across the ground below head height, it could take out a lot of men and a lot of horses. In Waterloo, for example, one infantry battalion lost an officer and 25 men to one cannonball.
You would see the enemy in front of you, you'd guess how far away he was, work out the charge, lay the gun or point the gun in the right direction and fire it. If it missed a bit, you would then relay the gun and fire again.
Artillery has come a long way since the days of empire. As anyone will tell you, this AS-90 is not a tank, it is a gun, an artillery piece, and a devastating one at that. It is considered by many to be the best of its kind in the world. So how did we get here? How was artillery developed to become the unchallenged killer of men on the battlefield, and is that still true?
In the 19th and 20th century, artillery has been hugely effective, and we're in danger of forgetting that. We think of volley fire from muskets or machine guns in the later part of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Certainly in the First World War, artillery was hugely effective.
When we come to World War I, there was a huge expansion in artillery on both sides. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that we've moved from direct fire to indirect fire.
There is a change in the way that artillery is used from being forward with the infantry, firing directly at targets they can see, to a gradual development of artillery placed further behind the trench lines, firing at an enemy they cannot see. So they're reliant on the eyes and ears of their artillery observers to see forward and then communicate what they see back to the gun line that becomes crucial. To begin with, you fire at a target, you'll perhaps miss with the first few rounds, and then you walk your shells onto the target under instruction from your artillery observer. By the end of the war, because we understand what the effect of weather meteorology has on ballistics, you can, with a greater degree of accuracy, predict where your shells are going to land.
We had to fire from a distance at a target we couldn't see, so we couldn't see the enemy. And to make this very accurate, we had to produce a thing called predicted fire, which meant we had to have good survey, so we knew exactly where the guns were, good survey where the target was, and an observation post that could see the target. And also we took into account the weather conditions, and when we fired this sort of artillery, it was very accurate. It became more accurate as it went on.
The early days of observation of fire were Mark I eyeball. The ability to see a target from a hill or wherever and to spot the fall of shot and pass the message back. Some of that message passing was done by heliograph. The heliograph was, of course, the system of flashing lights in a kind of Morse code using sunlight to produce these flashes back to the gun position.
One of the problems, of course, about the First World War and relaying information back to the gun position was we didn't have very good radios and things like that at the time, so it was a line, a telephone wire that had to be laid by people walking along with a line, digging it in, making sure it wasn't seen by the enemy, so that the information could be relayed back to the guns where the enemy was.
Yeah, this is Bravo 29er. Can you meet me landline? 3810, deflection, 3189er.
The way artillery fits into the modern battlefield is hugely important because of the wide range of fire control and coordination and command activities that a modern artillery commander has to undertake. He's leaning heavily on modern digitisation on computers and therefore has to be fully integrated into what all the other arms and services are doing in 21st century battle space.
Number 3 shot. Glory 09er, Bravo 09er, shot, Kilo, Kilo, 9503.
British artillery started the 20th century with the 12-pounder, which fired a small shell but was extremely accurate. World War I moved the goalposts, and guns grew from 8 inches through to 16-inch howitzers as the requirement to lay waste to vast tracts of land grew.
The howitzer was a halfway house between the cannon and the mortar. It could fire a more curved looping trajectory, not quite as high as the mortar, and it could also fire direct. So you had the capabilities of both with the howitzer, a very useful weapon, and we still have them today.
This is the AS90 self-propelled howitzer. Fires 155mm rounds. It's 96 pounds per shell. Fires smoke, high explosive, illuminating rounds to illuminate the area. A common misconception is that it's a tank. It looks much like a tank. However, the difference is between the artillery system and a tank is that a tank primary role is to fire direct, and they also fire on the move. The AS90 and other artillery systems fire from a static role and fire indirect as opposed to direct. The AS90 does have a capability to fire direct with an anti-tank role and also with what's called an AGLS, which is the automatic gun layer system, which fires at targets it sees but at an elevation as opposed to straight to the target.
Cambrai is well known as the first use of mass tanks in war, but the way artillery was used was equally revolutionary. With the tanks delegated the task of cutting the barbed wire, a task at which the artillery had failed at the Somme, the artillery was released for other tasks. Aerial reconnaissance was used to spot German artillery positions and plot them accurately, and over 1,000 guns were used on just a 10-kilometre wide front. Knowing where the targets were located was essential and allowed the 150 or so batteries to fire for a much shorter period than before, thus achieving both operational surprise and devastating effect. Later analysis showed that 90% of German batteries had been damaged or destroyed during the barrage. Artillery proved itself to be an awesome weapon during the Great War, but how was it used during the next war? Was it really so very different? What were the major technological changes and doctrinal innovations that happened during World War II?
In the Second World War, the Royal Artillery is larger than the Royal Navy, and this reflects its importance on the battlefield.
There's a recognition of the power of artillery, so there was much more available at the start of the Second World War than there had been at the start of the First World War. And even some of the railway guns were dug out of gun depots to be brought into action.
Ever since the Franco-Prussian War, where German technology comes to the battlefield, we mustn't forget that rail is hugely important to the business of artillery. Railways take ammunition and guns from their manufacturers to stockpiles and from arsenals to the front. But the logical development of that is that you create a gun that sits on a rail carriage and never moves off it. And so you get something which is unique to the continent. The British don't really go in for this very much, which is railway guns of huge calibre, because you can put a very large calibre gun on a piece of rolling stock. And you get varying calibres from 200 to 400, even as large as 800mm, which is the size of the largest battleship gun, 16-inch gun, which you can put on a rail carriage. Now those can project shells in the First and Second World Wars 25 miles with enormous, awesome destructive effect.
The types and natures of ammunition grew. The 25-pounder gun, for instance, suddenly produced an enormous range of different types of ammunition through smoke, armour piercing through, as a result of the desert warfare, radar echo shells to counter the radar, coloured smoke for signalling, coloured lights, propaganda shell, an endless range of ammunition. Others, the 5.5-inch gun, had a slightly smaller but similar range. The heavier guns stuck largely with high explosive shell because of their role. As far as fusing was concerned, the significant advance in fusing, I think, during World War II was the invention of radar and ultimately the proximity fuse, which was a sort of a radar or very high frequency radio transmitter based fuse, giving you accurate target sensing, which we hadn't had before.
If you're firing typically 300 rounds a day, and that's not excessive, and at some stages of the Second World War, British guns are firing 4,000 rounds a day. You can see from that you need huge quantities of ammunition brought up to the front to suitable supply dumps. And the business of logistics, particularly for the Royal Artillery, is a great force enabler or a force denier. And unless artillery is fully integrated into the logistics chain, and they have the right quantity of ammunition in the right calibre at the right place at the right time, then they're not going to be able to undertake fire missions in the way that they would wish to.
Fire! World War II saw the last use of really massed artillery, especially by the British and Soviets. In terms of the tactics used and the sheer scale of employment, you could say it was the zenith of artillery. The 25-pounder gun is synonymous with British artillery in all theatres during World War II. It saw action from Norway to Burma. The 25-pounder was one of the first weapons designed as a gun and howitzer, combining the best features of both of these types of weapon. It was able to fire projectiles in high arcs like howitzers and in the classic artillery manner, but its high velocity also allowed it to be fired along a flat trajectory. During the fighting in North Africa in 1941 and 42, the 25-pounder was pressed into service as an anti-tank weapon, where it proved itself more than capable of defeating German Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs and Italian M1340s at considerable ranges.
The Russians find in their war against the Germans that their mass use of artillery is the decisive factor on the battlefield. It's not men and it's not tanks, it's artillery. Artillery destroys an opponent, but can also crush their morale. So you don't even have to be wounded, let alone killed by an artillery shell, for your fighting effectiveness to be undermined. You can flee a battlefield just because you've been in an artillery barrage and you see the effect it has on those around you.
I think it was the psychological effect of artillery in war which was one of the biggest factors in draining the power to fight. And it's the thing that most war veterans remember most. It's the fact that you can be so mangled by artillery fire and you've no idea when it's coming. It comes at you out of the blue with precious little warning that is so deeply psychologically disturbing. And shell shock was the word given to it, and it meant what it said.
Any engineer in this country would break down in tears, I think, if he saw some of the engineering in the Russian guns, but the great advantage they had was that they had them in huge numbers. And as has often been said, you know, quantity has a quality all of its own. Their guns were very simple to fix and maintain. There's nothing very much on the Soviet D-30 you couldn't fix with a welding torch and a sledgehammer.
The more artillery units you can incorporate into your army, throwing death and destruction and shells at your enemy, the better off you're going to be. And the Russians are able to flood the battlefield with huge quantities of artillery. And the two kinds we really think of are tube artillery, which is a barrel firing a shell of some description at the enemy, and rocket artillery, which the Russians also developed really for the first time in the Second World War.
Perhaps one of the greatest innovations in artillery during World War II was the introduction of rocket artillery. The most famous of these is the Russian Katyusha. Prior to World War II, there was a technical artillery exchange program between the Soviets and Nazi Germany. Two of the most deadly and effective weapons to come out of this exchange program were artillery weapons. the BM Katyusha series, or Little Katy on the Soviet side, and the Nebelwerfer on the German side. The Katyusha consisted of a truck with rails mounted on top. Each truck was able to fire 24 132mm rounds. These 24 rockets were able to deliver devastating firepower out to a range of 9,000 metres. But what is so attractive or effective in military terms about rocket artillery?
We look at the advantage of a rocket system, and that is it is very simple. It is very cheap. You just take a box and you throw it in the back of an old lorry, and basically with a couple of handles to wind it around, you've got yourself a rocket system. The downside is that rockets are pretty inaccurate and inconsistent. However, if you throw enough of them around, the philosophy of, throw lots and lots of things into the wall, you'll achieve the aim.
They're very powerful weapons. They tend to be area weapons. They're not as accurate, but they're much simpler to use. You don't have to do quite so much training to use them. You bomb up a launcher, you press the button and off goes a mass of rockets. Tremendous amount of firepower, but not terribly accurate. It's very scary. And we have them today in the form of the multi-launch rocket system.
It has a pod of 12 rockets and fires them over a distance of 30 kilometres approximately. It can take out such a vast area, a kilometre square. During the first Gulf War, these were used extensively and concentrated into these big grid squares to destroy anything that was in there.
They're colloquially referred to as grid square removers. Large amounts of ammunition can be unleashed on a very small area, which will pretty much destroy all undefended or poorly defended targets within that area. And of course that's a great troop morale boost if you're watching those head off towards the enemy, and a real morale destroyer if you're on the receiving end of that sort of system.
Into the future, the MLRS launch platform will also be used to launch the Army's ATACMS, or Army Tactical Missile System.
Target Eastings, 584.
A single MLRS launcher in 1 minute can deliver as many bomblets to a target as 3 regiments of 155mm guns in that same minute, firing rate intense. So we're talking about an extremely powerful weapon. It has its disadvantages. It has a huge signature. You can see from miles off where it is when it fires. So it's very vulnerable to attack once it fires. And it tends, once it's fired, to have to shoot and scoot. It disappears rapidly to go and get more ammunition and to lie up until it's required to be used again. But each launcher is immensely powerful, and the new submunitions that are coming into being now, being developed, are extremely powerful, particularly in the anti-armour role. And I think it's one of the ways ahead for artillery that when it is capable of taking out tanks before they can reach the battlefield, it spells the end for the use of tanks the way they have been used in the past.
Throughout the 70s and 80s, the Russians continued to develop more potent and effective rocket artillery. Their real trump card was the BM-22 Smerch, a 220mm self-propelled rocket system with a range of 90 kilometres. It was almost 10 years before the US and NATO responded with anything comparable. One of the interesting legacies of World War II that still dominates military thinking today is that of the Nazi V weapons. Known as the V1 and V2 Revenge or Vengeance weapons, both carried a 1-ton warhead. These weapons are the direct ancestors of today's cruise missile and Scud generation. Today, Scud-type weapons may have a great psychological or political impact, but they are really only any serious threat when combined with chemical or biological weapons. With the West so far behind in the development and use of rocket artillery, it's probably just as well that the Cold War never turned hot. But the artillery arm would see significant use in other conflicts in the late 20th century.
We can see that artillery is hugely important in Vietnam, where one of the techniques used to subdue the north of the country, and particularly the demilitarised zone, was to set up fire bases, which were reinforced camps manned by the US Army and the US Marines that contained a variety of different arms of the battlefield, a bit of armour, but that wasn't so important, troops who would dominate the local region and would be supported by the artillery within the firebase.
Another first was the introduction of self-propelled artillery. The British managed to mount the 25-pounder gun on 3 vehicles, the Priest, Bishop and this one, the Sexton, a 25-pounder on a Sherman chassis.
Because the battlefield can be so broad now, you know, we could be firing there one minute and there the next. Self-propelled guns do provide the effect of being able to switch from one target to another and bring down lots of artillery fire onto that target very quickly. Some other guns it takes a while to manoeuvre into position, but once that comes into position that can fire on any target, anywhere in a circle very quickly.
The Army seems to have got a fine balance. Based on the way the world is today, you do need to be flexible and be able to operate in lots of different environments. AS-90 is perfect for what we had to do in the Gulf War, i.e. pull up and destroy large areas, large targets.
It was the Germans really who pioneered the use and types of self-propelled guns that would dominate Western post-war mechanised armies. The Panzers needed artillery that was armoured and could keep up in a fast-moving battle situation or shoot and scoot as the situation required. They came up with 2 types, the Wesp and Hummel, or as we would say, Wasp and Bumblebee. The Wesp carried a 5-man crew and was equipped with a 105mm field howitzer. The gun barrel could traverse from an elevation of -5 to +42 degrees from horizontal. The Wesp's 6-cylinder Maybach petrol engine propelled the gun to a maximum road speed of 40 km/h. The larger Hummel had a 6-man crew and a 155mm gun. They both saw extensive action on the Eastern Front during the German invasion of Russia. During the Falklands War in '82, the British had the 105 light gun and the 4.5-inch naval gun, but they were up against some pretty tough competition. The Argentinians fielded the 155 heavy gun, which outranged them.
In the Falklands, we used our 105mm light guns, but we also used naval gunfire support. And one of our areas of training is to train officers to control naval gunfire in support of the land operation. And the combination of our 105s and naval gunfire support was what, in effect, really ended the war in the Falklands. General Menendez, the Argentinian commander, actually said at the end of the war, "Your infantry won the battles, your artillery won the war."
The Falklands War saw the light gun come into its own. It fired hundreds of rounds and it was very reliable. It didn't break down. It fired that many rounds that the recoil systems were actually starting to get very hot. But it was that efficient and that good that it carried on firing. Some other guns would break down because remember their oil gets very hot, springs get very hot. The breech mechanisms were very efficient and very reliable. And the detachments, again, loved the gun because you could see round it. It was, you know, you could move it about the way you wanted to. And it was a very, what I call, user-friendly gun. The light gun, any gun that can be put under a helicopter, flown into very difficult places to get to, quick into action, have high rates of fire, can fire high angles, so we can fire into mountainous areas, and then be hooked up and move again quick.
Well, the logistical advantage of the light gun is the fact that it is small and it only takes one vehicle to actually tow it. The ammunition is smaller than it is for the bigger artillery, so it can be moved a lot easier and a greater amount. Also,
in other theatres of operation like Afghanistan, AS-90 can't drive around the mountaintops and take targets out there, therefore you need light gun, which can be airdropped and carried a lot easier.
In 1982, there was recognition of another revolution in the use of artillery. The Israelis used remotely piloted vehicles against the Syrians. These had real-time TV cameras on board, which linked the images back to allow instant artillery response in both offensive and defensive situations.
In the past, technology was just not able to allow you to destroy an enemy almost at will with that degree of accuracy and timeliness. And in the future, artillery is going to be able to achieve that, and is already beginning to. And the eye in the sky, this ability to observe with an unmanned aerial vehicle, is going to be crucial to any army in the future being able to do that.
We now fly unmanned aerial vehicles as observers with thermal imaging, which can pick up targets in mist and dark and relay that information back in real time to gun positions.
We can also use it to go back and see what has been done. So we know that we've had the effect that we wanted, which is called battle damage assessment. Another thing that Phoenix is very, very good at, because we can fly over real time and see what effect we've had and see whether we need to go back and restrike with the effect to achieve our aim.
The UAV is out there localizing the target, pinning the target, and making sure that that information is spread to the most appropriate weapons. Now those weapons could be an artillery piece or a GMLRS system, or it could be a attack helicopter, or it could be a fighter bomber of some kind. And really what you're talking about is through networking capability, which UAVs are going to be absolutely instrumental in providing, in my view, is the ability to get onto a target with the most appropriate weapon in the fastest time possible.
In the Falklands in 1982 and Iraq in 2003, we have naval gunfire support. Also, warships out to sea firing inland, supporting land operations. So although we're talking about coordinating fire support in terms of artillery on land, we need to remember that if there's water nearby, we may need to coordinate naval gunfire as well. If we throw in close air support coming from the skies, where your air forces are supporting land operations, today's fire support coordinator in the 21st century needs to be able to coordinate land artillery, artillery from the sea, and close air support coming from the skies, and that becomes a very complicated job.
Ориентир 35, право 20, ниже 5.
By the time we come to the period of the Cold War, in the second half of the 20th century, artillery was changing yet again, and there was a greater recognition of the need for heavy guns for dealing with armour. If you're dealing with tanks, you need something fairly heavy to stop them, and the lighter field guns like the 25-pounders of the Second World War, even the 105mm guns that we had in service in the 60s and 70s, were insufficient to counter Warsaw Pact artillery. We needed heavier guns and more of them.
Of course, NATO and the Warsaw Pact weren't the only boys in the artillery development game. In the quest for longer and longer ranges, there were other serious players, such as the South Africans. The South African Denel Company's G652 is touted as the world's most advanced artillery system. This rugged, six-wheeled, self-propelled 155 howitzer has an off-road speed of almost 70 kilometers per hour, and computer-controlled ammunition carousels inside the turret give it a rate of fire of above 8 rounds per minute. It is a state-of-the-art 155mm gun, and combined with rocket-assisted projectiles has a range of just under 70 kilometers, far in excess of any similar system. This means a single G652 is able to cover an area of approximately 1,700 square kilometers from its deployment position. BAE Systems have designed an ultra-lightweight field howitzer, the M777. At half the weight of a normal 155mm gun and a fraction of the weight of armoured self-propelled guns, it can be easily lifted by helicopter or towed. It has a maximum range of just under 30 kilometers for standard ammunition, but the plan for the future is for it to fire the Excalibur inertial nav and GPS guided rounds. The M777 will be able to deliver 5 rounds a minute at a range of 40 kilometers to an accuracy of 10 meters. From Sweden comes the impressive FH-77 155mm howitzer. Primarily a towed gun, it has its own internal power pack for local mobility. The gun has a range of over 40 kilometres and fully automatic magazines achieve a rate of fire in excess of 9 rounds a minute. Even better, this gun is also integrated with a 6x6 all-terrain vehicle, complete with land navigation system, ballistics computer and muzzle velocity radar, giving it full autonomy on the battlefield. This makes the FH-77 an extremely powerful, highly mobile artillery system. In the 20th century, artillery didn't just develop in terms of calibre and self-propelled mountings. There were, of course, other innovations which transformed the capability of artillery.
The shell is the weapon of artillery, the gun is simply a means of getting it there. The basic weapon is the high explosive shell. It's a metal-bodied item and it is simply filled with high explosive fused with some kind of fuse, whether that fuse function on impact or whether it function in the air. The high explosive shell is very, very simple and relatively cheap to manufacture. The concept simply is that the high explosive will function and the shell body will break up into a very, very large number of small pieces, and they will be projected fast and they will do whatever damage.
Technology, and the latest technology, has got to be harnessed to your own warfare systems, particularly on land. So the more accurate your artillery is, of course, the more economical you're going to be with the ammunition. You need much less of it to do the same job. And then once you're able to land your ammunition in the right place, you want it to do the maximum damage with the minimum amount of investment. So to begin with, we're using shrapnel, in other words, an artillery round containing originally shrapnel balls invented by later Major General Sir Henry Shrapnel, which are musket balls put in a shell.
Really what he's done there is take the musket ball and embed it inside the gunpowder in the shell to give you more bits to throw around the target area. He's taken the power of the musket right up into the target area without exposing the musketeer to any danger.
Bomblet artillery works, or bomblet ammunition works, in that the projectile is filled with small little canisters that are carried in the projectile. At a certain spot on its trajectory, the projectile will detonate and the bomblets will be released, and they can actually come down, some on a little parachute, and they have a number of functions really. They can be tank destroyers. If they land on a tank, destroys a tank, or it can operate on the ground and destroy troops on the ground.
Into the future, I think we're looking at extending the range for, first of all, light guns slightly. We might be able to push that out to probably 20 kilometres, give or take a bit. AS-90 to the 30 to 40 kilometres range, probably. And then MLRS fitted with the ATACMS system, for instance, could well push out to sort of 300 kilometres or so.
As artillery has progressed and is able to fire its munitions further and further, accuracy has become critical. So today the crucial part of any artillery system is accuracy. That is making sure you know precisely where your shot is going to fall and whether it's going to affect any innocent civilians or friendly forces in the area.
Artillery is carrying a lot of responsibility for providing quick and economic solutions that are what we might call casualty light, and particularly light in terms of civilian casualties.
You can fire 100 rounds at the same target or elevation, same information, and those 100 rounds won't land in the same place. There is a thing called the zone of the gun, which has got quite a funny shape, so we can't guarantee that that shell will land in that same spot every time. So this is not good if we are firing at an enemy that is close to civilians. One would hope that the future will bring in guided artillery ammunition. Very expensive, we know that, but far more effective and far safer, not just for civilians, but for our own troops as well, and the troops that are working with us.
Accuracy of artillery targeting today is greatly improved through the use of unmanned aerial vehicles to carry out observation missions. This was a far riskier affair in earlier days. Today's artillery pieces may not necessarily be larger than their predecessors, but the combination of firepower and accuracy gives them the potential to be far more effective in 21st century warfare. The British-made AS-90 is not just about excellence of design, actually designed by the troops themselves. The experts tell us that systems like the AS-90 will only be one among many other connected systems on the digitised battlefield. The US did have a very similar programme to the British AS-90 called Crusader, a futuristic, high-tech integrated artillery system. But this highly developed and costly war machine never saw service. Like so many sophisticated, cutting-edge military machines, it was eventually cancelled. With wars in Afghanistan and Iraq in recent memory, if it is to retain any real influence on the battlefield, artillery has to prove that it is effective in both high and low intensity conflict.
Low intensity means you're not sure who your enemy is sometimes. There are a lot of civilians, some of whom may be up to mischief, some of whom are completely innocent. You may have aid workers and television and media correspondents wandering in and out of the place, all of whom you need to be able to differentiate between so that they don't become targets themselves. And the specifics of whether it's special forces or artillery surveying and spotting devices actually being able to not only see a target but interpret what it is and what it's doing and then work out the best time to destroy it is still very much something that artillery can provide, whereas the services of air forces cannot. If we look at artillery in the 21st century, there is increasing responsibility being put on its shoulders to get the job right and not to kill civilians.
British Major General J.B.A. Bailey, one of the world's leading artillery experts, describes a combat intensity threshold which must be crossed for artillery to be required, and states that in many counterinsurgency or coin operations this simply won't be the case. But when the guns are not required, the gunners don't sit idly at home.
Gunners can also be used as infantry and have been converted from regiments of artillery into battalions of infantry for use when we don't need to use the firepower of our big guns. We turn to our rifles and turn ourselves into infantrymen.
Since the earliest days of artillery and cannons, we have witnessed giant technological leaps in the way that munitions are delivered by artillery. But what are the deadliest weapons in the 21st century?
The latest shell that we in the United Kingdom are using is a bomblet shell. It fires a little bomblet, well, in fact it fires 49 of the little things, which is designed anti-personnel and anti-armour. It is delivered from the air, it bursts several hundred metres in the air so that it spreads out over a target area, and it functions on impact. Unlike previous versions, which particularly when fired into soft sand and things like that, would give us a very high dud rate, this one has got a self-destruct system in it, and 15 seconds after it leaves the shell, if it hasn't found anything or if it's failed to function, it will simply destroy itself.
The main rounds we were using was L20, which is a bomblet round. It basically contains 64 anti-personnel mines and 46 anti-armour mines. So obviously, if you can imagine, we've got 8 guns from our battery alone firing onto a specific target with up to 10 rounds at a time. That's 10 rounds per gun. You've got 80 rounds per volley of bomblet round just landing on an area. I mean, that's enough to dishearten anybody, I think.
Inside the little bomblet, the anti-armour function is a copper cone with explosive packed around it. The explosive, when it functions, basically collapses the cone from the top outwards, squeezing it and accelerating it forward as a solid jet of metal, but at very, very high velocity, giving us therefore a penetrative ability. This will penetrate light armour quite comfortably.
The ammunition today, of course, is bomblet, minelet, and the future looks like it's going to be guided munitions for artillery.
Into the future, the MLRS launch platform will also be used to launch the Army's ATACMS, or Army Tactical Missile System. The ATACMS munitions are significant because they have ranges of between 165 and 300 kilometres. They have multiple warheads, submunitions, anti-armour, anti-personnel. The MLRS is being continually developed to include delayed detonation warheads for building penetration and bunker busting. A very futuristic munition system called 155 Bonus has been developed jointly by Bofors and GIAT. Although appearing like a standard 155 artillery shell, after firing the shell deploys 2 sub-munitions that in turn search for individual targets. Key to the operation of the system is the infrared heat-seeking target detector made by BAE Systems.
The temptation in the future is to go down the route of the fully digitised battlefield and assume that computers will always work. And if you like, this is the Tom Clancy school of future warfare, where technology always provides the answer and always works every time.
Our soldiers are in fact very highly trained, and they need a lot of training and a lot of opportunity to do that training in order to keep up to date with modern technology.
Whilst it may no longer be the god of war, a sensible and flexible mix of heavy SP guns and light air transportable guns fully integrated into the digitised battlefield means that the future of artillery is secure, if not bright.